Willkommen zurück aus der Pause. Wir machen weiter. In der nächsten Session haben wir Artists as Residents. I think I probably should carry on in English. I always do that. Sorry about this. So now, welcome back from the break. And I'm really pleased to have this session as an opener after Petra's talk, because we open this up internationally. So we have got somebody from the United States, somebody from Australia, but also we're bringing both aspects, both perspectives together here. One from an institutional perspective, one how it is to work with an institution from an artist perspective. So I'm really pleased to welcome Barbara Stauffer and Janet Lawrence. And so we'll hear first from Barbara Stauffer. And then we have a short session for questions. But then what we do is we group, keep hold of all of your questions for after Janet's talk, when we can then ask all of the questions to both of them together. We thought that might be more fruitful, because then we can benefit from both of their answers to possibly single questions that should be answered by both institutional representative, if I stereotype you as that, and from the artist representatives. So we start off with Barbara. She is from the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., where she's had a long career, and where she's currently Chief of Community Programs and holds the threads to an awful lot of programs that we will hear about now. Thank you very much for coming. And
So good morning. I'm delighted to be here. So thank you to Anita and Johannes and the Museum für Naturkunde for inviting me. And I'm here to talk to you about the Smithsonian's Artist Research Program. Thank you. And in particular, the artists who've elected to work at the Natural History Museum. So I'll give you a little background to start off with. The Smithsonian was founded in 1846, and since then it's grown to be the world's largest museum and research complex. It's made up of research facilities, including, but not limited to, an astrophysical observatory, a tropical research institute. We have a zoological park. We have 19 science, history, culture, and art museums, including, but also not limited to, the American History Museum, the Air and Space Museum, the Freer-Sackler Gallery of Asian Art, Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, the National Museum of African Art, and the National Museum of Natural History. There are 6,400 employees, of which 500 are scientists who are studying and caring for collections, and the collection's total is 156 million objects, specimens, and works of art. So as you can imagine, there's kind of ripe full of resources, lots of topics and locations for multidisciplinary studies. In 2007, a group of art curators launched a fellowship program at the Smithsonian. It's called the Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, and it's often referred to as SARF, and I will just refer to it as SARF in the talk. The program provides stipends for approximately 12 visiting visual artists a year to conduct collections-based research at the Smithsonian Institution. It's designed for already established artists, meaning that applicants have to have a demonstrated record of artistic accomplishment and a strong exhibition history outside of their home region. Once selected, the fellows spend 1 to 2 months in residence at the Smithsonian, at the museum or the area of Smithsonian of their choice, immersed in its collections and actually in conversation with the curators and collections managers and other researchers who work on those collections. There's no requirement that the artists create or exhibit artwork. So it's a completely open-ended opportunity for a kind of cross-disciplinary exploration. So in the first 10 years of the fellowship, it's now 10 years old, the Smithsonian has hosted 130 artists from around the world. And they've studied collections not only in the public museums and galleries, but also Smithsonian's non-public areas, which include libraries, archives, gardens, laboratories, storage facilities, and field sites, both in the US and overseas. And so again, the program is designed to kind of really engage the breadth and the depth of what Smithsonian has to offer. So the SARF curatorial committee has often remarked at the high number of applicants that want to work at the Natural History Museum. And so those in red are the ones who have. And that's 42 of the 130 fellows, just about a third. That's compared to 23 who've conducted research at the American History Museum, that's the second most requested venue, and 20 who've conducted research at the National Museum of African Art, which is next in popularity. So I'm giving you these numbers not to brag, although it is exciting that the interest in our collections is so strong, but to actually just demonstrate the fact that there's a desire to work with what the Natural History Museum has, and that our collections excite kind of the imagination and open avenues to pretty rich inquiries. Before I go on, I want to just give you a little background about the museum, give you a sense of what we do have. The museum itself opened in 1910. It's dedicated to preserving, studying, and interpreting the world's most extensive collection of natural history specimens and human artifacts. We are an anthropology museum as well. And research takes place in anthropology, botany, entomology, mineral sciences, invertebrate zoology, paleobiology, and vertebrate zoology. And our collections count of the 156 million is 145 million. It's also a lot of very small things. So that 145 million actually is a result of acquiring several million parasites last year from the US Department of Agriculture's National Parasite Collection. But we have a lot of things. We're also the most visited natural history museum in the world, with 7 million visitors a year. And so my role here, where I'm come into the picture, is that my background, right now I'm in charge of community programs at the museum, and I spent over 20 years in exhibitions at the museum. I became aware of the program when I was in charge of temporary exhibitions, and I'll explain a little bit later why. But I've been a huge supporter since then. So I'm not a curator, I'm not a scientist, nor am I part of the SARF committee, but I'm really a liaison between the artists and the committee and the scientists as they're kind of trying to figure out who they might want to work with and submitting an application, and then a huge advocate in figuring out how to bring their work to the public. So I'm just going to give you a taste of some of the artists who have worked in the collections. Start off with Shih Huang. He's a Taiwanese-born mixed media artist, and he was in the first cohort of fellows in 2007. He worked with our curator of fishes, and he explored bioluminescent organisms in the collections and then translated those into this installation called The Bright Beneath. Rachel Berwick is a glass artist who teaches at the Rhode Island School of Design. She worked with a curator at the National Zoo, as well as curators and collections managers in our birds division, and she studied bird migration. And this installation, Zugonruhe, was inspired by and based on a cast of Martha. Martha is the last surviving passenger pigeon. She died in a Cincinnati zoo in 1910, and her corpse was sent to the museum and is preserved in the collection, and is obviously a huge symbol of extinction, especially given how prevalent passenger pigeons were before. Jocelyn Châteauvert is a paper artist with a studio in Charleston, North Carolina. And during her residency, she worked with one of our botany curators and our botanical illustrator, and she studied the properties of plants that make paper, can be used to make paper. And she also accompanied the botany curator on a research trip to Guyana. And that resulted in an installation that evokes Guyana's rich vegetation and environment, including this piece, Swift Falls. Tracy Hicks was a Texas-raised installation artist who used museum jars and scientific specimens to interrogate the practice of collecting. Unfortunately, he died unexpectedly in 2014, which is a great loss to his scientist and artist colleagues and friends. But during his fellowship, he worked with our herpetology curators to study amphibians, particularly the causes and the factors contributing to their demise. And he kept a wonderful visual journal of his time at the museum, and that's one of the images. Joseph Gerhardt and Ruth Jarman make up the British multimedia duo known as Semiconductor. And for their residency, they elected to do research with volcanologists in our mineral sciences division. And that resulted in very explicitly in two media pieces. One is called Where Shapes Come From. That was filmed in the mineral sciences lab and considers how science translates nature on an atomic level. And Worlds in the Making explores how we observe, experience, and create an understanding of the physical origins of the world around us. Beth Lipman is a Wisconsin-based glass artist. She's best known for her still life compositions that reference the work of 16th and 17th century European painters. And during her time at the Smithsonian, she worked with one of our paleobotanists, and she learned about kind of prehistoric plant life, as well as concepts of the Anthropocene, something that our curator is working on. And her piece, Laid Timetable with Cycads, was inspired by this research that she did. Annet Couwenberg is a textile artist based in Baltimore. She teaches at the Maryland Institute College of Art. And during her time at Natural History, she worked in the Division of Fishes, actually with the same curator that Huang worked with. And she researched fish anatomy through 3D imaging. And she created sculptural structures based on those 3D scans. And this piece, Cleft, is part of an extensive series that was based on these 3D scans. This one was inspired in part by a study of sturgeon scales. Just very quickly, since we're here in Berlin, I wanted to give a shout out to one of the most recent SARF fellows. Matthias Mansen is Berlin-based. He's a print artist, and his residency involved researching the extensive prints and illustrations that were created during the US exploring expedition of 1838 to 1842. This was actually challenging. One thing I didn't mention is, but a number of these artists work with multiple museums. They might work with 2, 3, 4 collections. He had to work with almost every single every single museum, library, and archive at the Smithsonian because that collection is so distributed throughout. So I'm sure he's still digesting his experience since he just finished. So the residency, as I hope I've demonstrated, provides an opportunity for really incredible creative conversations and collaborations. It's throughout the Smithsonian, of course, but I think at Natural History there's really some interesting things going on. And the fellowships inspire new directions and creative expressions for the artists, certainly, and hopefully, ideally, for the Smithsonian staff who work with them. The curators who have worked with the artists certainly are very, very enthusiastic. The Fishes curator I mentioned, who worked with Chieh Huang and Annet Couwenberg, Lynn Parenti, she speaks pretty eloquently about the experience and says, "An artist as a fellow in a science museum disrupts our way of thinking and seeing. I offer access to the specimens and some specialized knowledge about them. What we get in return is a unique interpretation of their beauty and value." But what about the museum? Has the SARF program changed us? I like to think so, but I think we're just at the very beginning of the process. I'd definitely like to see the program have more visibility, both within the museum community and with our own public audiences. This would require kind of a deeper commitment to integrating their work and their art into our exhibitions and programming. And there are some, we've had some successes. We were able to display the Shih Huang Bright Beneath installation at the museum. This was in 2011. This was the first time that we've actually showed contemporary art like this within the museum context. We dedicated a gallery to it. There was some nervousness at the museum about how the public would receive something so unexpected. So we actually did an evaluation, and it was, the results were actually quite positive. It was interesting because just kind of in thinking about and constructing the evaluation, we had to kind of come up with questions that are different than we usually ask, because it's often about what people learn from an exhibition. So we did actually ask if people felt that they learned more about bioluminescence as a result of it, and they did. But we also kind of tried to get at their sense of awe and wonder and what the experience itself was like, and that was extremely positive as well. We hosted a public program one evening where we featured Annet Couwenberg and Lynn Parenti talking about their collaboration around the fellowship. And we had over 100 people register for the program, great enthusiasm, great comments afterwards. People wanted more. And then over the years, in part as a result of the fellowship, we've developed a really great relationship with a really wonderful curator at the Smithsonian's American Art Museum, and she's also one of the SARF program coordinators. She put together an exhibition at her museum on bird extinction called The Singing in the Silence, and this was actually inspired by the story of Martha and featured Rachel Berwick's Zugunruhe piece on the extinction of the passenger pigeon, and then photographs by Joanne Brennan, another SARF artist. And, very exciting news, but we quite recently, received approval to develop a natural history museum exhibition on art that explores the concept of the Anthropocene. So again, contemporary art around the idea of the Anthropocene. And so we will be, obviously, as we're looking at potential artists and certainly looking at programming around it, look at or draw on the fellowship artists who've been at natural history. There are challenges. And I would say they kind of two main categories. Really what I would like to see is that we're more systematic about how we engage the artist fellows. And the challenges have to do with the fact that the program itself is really essentially volunteer run. The art curators who run it, there's kind of no central office, there's no central administration, there's no central support. There is funding, but they are the ones who kind of do it by committee in the time that they have outside of their regular jobs. So that really just means that it's really hard to even communicate internally in the way that you want, even knowing which artists have been selected and when exactly they're coming for their residency. That can be challenging. So it really is kind of these relationships between the artists and the individual curators. And then the artists aren't dinosaurs. And by that I mean that the Natural History Museum has kind of huge priorities, including a major renovation of our dinosaur hall, scheduled to open in 2 years. That's the biggest of them, but there are many others. So again, just kind of really getting this to be on the museum's radar, dedicating a space potentially, and overcoming some of the concerns about, what is the value of all the things we have to do, what is the value of these programs. Those are, again, challenges, but I don't think probably not surprising challenges to people listening. And I have great hope. The program celebrates its 10th anniversary officially in the fall, and there'll be a symposium and other programming that will be an opportunity, I think, to create visibility again within the organization, reflect on what has happened to date, highlight some of the great successes, and hopefully lead to some greater support, awareness and support within the institution, and then within the Natural History Museum. And I would say I look forward to kind of spending the next 10 years continuing to show artists and kind of build a little bit more of an infrastructure to the extent that we can for incorporating their great work in our work. So thank you. I've got the website for the fellowship over there. I'm sorry it's long. But I got the URL. So it's really, I mean, you have to, it's kind of your credentials as an artist and the case you make for the work you're going to do and why that has to happen at Smithsonian, nowhere else. And that really does depend on establishing a relationship with a curator in advance, and that can actually be the hardest thing. So that's kind of my role within natural history, is to kind of help people identify who they might talk to and get to help sponsor them.